I have no idea where this tape comes from, but it ended up in my studio. So I'll be recording our conversation here. It's a 60-minute tape, so there will be a break of 30 minutes. We have to turn the tape around. And this is to give you kind of a feeling about how tape has kind of a length you have to relate to. Another thing is, we need to have a feeling for a tape. And I think a lot of people haven't really touched tape in many years. So I had this idea that let's all feel tape. And let's see how much tape actually is. I think this is a 60-minute tape.
It's beautiful.
It is. And tape plays at 5 centimeters per second.
Yeah.
So you need tape to be really thin. So you need a lot of tape.
When I was a teenager, 17 years old, in the 70s, I worked at a factory that manufactured cassette tape. Yeah, it was called Columbia Magnetics in Bethel, Connecticut. And it was around 1975, 1976. And I didn't know what the job was. I found it in the newspaper, and it was sweeping floors in the middle of the night with a cleanup crew. And it was a really interesting factory. It was really ghostly at night, but all the lights were on in all the rooms, or the industrial rooms, where they had these huge machines that were doing huge spools of this magnetic tape, which that would eventually sort of get parsed down to whatever tape was necessary, and cassette tapes were coming out of there. And I had no romance with cassette tapes at that time, because they were just sort of...
That was your work?
Yeah, they were just sort of part of the audio world, so I didn't really give it any kind of special notice. And it was a horrible job, sweeping floors in the middle of the night, and I only lasted there for a few months. But in retrospect, it's kind of, I'm really sort of happy that I had that experience of working at a tape magnetics factory.
Yeah.
Now that we're here talking about it.
And you're here years later, and I'm...
Well, I used to have to sweep this shit up all the time. So now that you're unspooling it, it's giving me a little bit of a kind of like a nightmare of like.
Yeah. And actually doing this is something I don't really do a lot, so it's kind of a bad feeling that you destroy it.
It's like Christmas in a way.
Yes. I don't know if there's Queen on this one as well. So I'd like to pass this around so everybody can just get a touch and feel of cassette tape. Pass it around. So you recorded. So you worked at this factory making tapes.
Yeah.
When this was in the.
It's like around 1975.
1975. Because cassette tapes were invented by Philips in 1962 or 63. It's a bit unclear, and it became a mass market product in 1965. Philips would argue with the other manufacturers about patents and stuff like this. But it became a mass product in 1965, and they spent a few years trying to get it right. But in the 70s, it became really a huge thing.
Yeah, it was the I think it wasn't the largest selling format for recorded music at some point.
In 1984.
Okay.
Apparently. If you say 84, everybody thinks that was the big time of vinyl, but tapes actually outsold vinyl in 1984.
Well, as you know, home taping was killing music.
Yeah, do you remember those? Some of you haven't seen this, but sometimes some record labels had on the inner bag of the LP, it had a warning that you shouldn't tape this record, because it would, you have to spread it around. Everybody needs to feel this. Come on.
Well, it would discourage the consumers from buying the actual vinyl record, because you were taping it and giving it to your friends, which also became like the scourge of digital music later on to a much further extent. But there would be a little image, there would be a little icon of a cassette tape package with like like sort of like evil X's in the eyes where the spools were, and I would say home taping is killing music.
It's like a piracy thing.
Yeah.
And I wonder how many people were inspired to actually record because of that. Like, I could record.
Yeah,
It's a
well,
cool looking logo.
Well, certainly you and I were.
Yes, I remember that. That was very nice.
Did you have 8-track tapes in Norway and Europe?
No.
Those are in America. It was like this horrible kind of. It was a. I think it was a fatter tape, possibly. It was like 8-track tape. You know what I'm talking about? The 8-track or 8-track cartridges, and they were very popular in America for like the sort of youth market in early 70s.
And in cars.
And yeah, you had 8-track players in cars, and they were like these big, bulky 8-track cassette shells that you would jam into the 8-track player, and the songs would just sort of stop, and then it would click over to the next track, and it would start up again. And I think as a musical artist, that must have been really infuriating to hear your song just sort of like stop because the tape was wound out, and then it would have to click over again and continue. But to us, it was always really sort of funny that it would do that.
So if you listen to like a prog rock album of the 70s, which, you know, the side-long songs would be like every 3 minutes would be pushing.
You know that film Dazed and Confused? They really sort of show that in that film. In fact, that scene at the end where they're just sort of jamming I think the Kiss 8-track into the machine, and they're racing over the Texas highway to go get Aerosmith, take us 3 hours away. I really related to that. So cassettes became the standard. In fact, in America, when everybody had 8-track players, these big old clunky 8-track players, and I remember seeing somebody who had a player in their car that took this kind of cassette, like the standard cassette, and thinking that was really sophisticated. And then, of course, that became the norm when I think consumers realized that 8-tracks were just complete bullshit. But they really sold 8-track tapes to the American consumer in a big way.
Yes, I remember my father was an enthusiast of American cars, so he had a Cadillac, 60s Cadillac, and it had like our regular tapes couldn't fit.
Yeah.
So like, what is this thing? And we never had tapes that could fit in my dad's car. And we would drive around listening to the radio.
They were absurd. You couldn't record on them. There was no 8-track player that also recorded. I think there was, but nobody really sort of utilized it. So that the culture of recording on 8-tracks was not. It never really came into play so much. It wasn't really until cassettes became quite huge in the USA, where all of a sudden people started recording albums on cassettes, and that was when the industry started freaking out about LP sales being challenged by people sharing their music on cassettes.
I remember I talked to Attila Zihag, he sings in Solo and Mayhem, and he said he grew up in Romania, and he remembered they could go and rent metal LPs, and they would bring them home, and they would record them and then bring them back the next day.
Yeah.
And they would rent out LPs and then record them. They couldn't afford to buy imports. You know, one guy in the whole town will buy it, and he would rent it out, and people would record it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting.
He was a metal guy. Maybe there was somebody else down the street who was renting out some youth albums.
Maybe. But I always, when I was a 13-year-old kid, I used to sort of spend a lot of time recording things on a cassette, like a Radio Shack cassette recorder, not unlike this one you have here, maybe a little bigger. And I held on to those recordings, and I actually put some of them on this solo record I did in the early 2000s. It was called Trees Outside the Academy, and there's a track on it called Thurston at 13, which is basically these recordings I had made on cassette tape as a 13-year-old, and for no reason. I mean, it was there in the household, and I realized that I could actually sort of record, And so I was making sounds on it, and I was doing descriptive recording where I was like, here's the sound of a penny falling on the table, and I would do it. And then here's the sound of a pencil being thrown against a window, and I would do it, and I would record it.
You would say
it's
that...
a session of sounds.
Okay, you would explain the sound.
Yeah, but I was, so, 20 years later, I found this cassette, and I was like, I thought it would actually kind of work well on a solo record. But you never heard it, so.
No. Sorry. I did the same thing. I was young. I grew up on a farm, and I would start recording over tapes that I bought, because in those days you couldn't check out stuff. You would just buy something. You hear about it, you would buy it. And I got this Norwegian hard rock band called TNT. And it turned out they were terrible. Really awful. So what did I do with this tape? There was no eBay. You couldn't sell. You just stuck with the stuff you bought. So I just actually have that tape now, and it's recording of me driving on my moped.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's fantastic.
I would drive a moped. It was a farm. Nobody cared. and I had these small ghetto blaster, and I could put it on the back.
Well, it's funny. Ghetto blasters were so were such a part of the culture of cassettes in a way, and the bigger they got, the more fascinating it was. And I remember, on tour, my first couple of tours that Sonic Youth would do in a van crisscrossing USA or Europe, everybody would sort of bring a few cassettes of mixtapes of what they wanted to listen to on tour, and you sort of was subject to the rest of the people in the van to like what you were listening to at the time. And so that was always fun. And then people you would meet on tour would gift you a cassette with like a mixtape, and that was always cool. And you would hear this stuff, or a band would give you their like forthcoming record. They would just record it on cassette for you, and you would hear like this new record by this band, and you would sort of spread the word. And that was kind of part of that. But we had a van that the cassette player. It finally had its day, and it just broke, and we were just getting ready for tour again, and we knew that there was no cassette player in the van. And so I was entrusted to sort of get a cassette player for the van that was portable. And so I was given, access to like a couple $100, and of which I was supposedly going to spend like maybe $60 to buy like a cool little portable cassette player. And this was at the advent of like LL Cool J's radio, and hip hop was sort of taking on this new edge with Def Jam, and I was just like, I'm going to go get the biggest boom box that I can buy in New York City. But I didn't want to tell the band that, because I would have been shot down. They were like, you can't waste your money on it. But I knew I was going to do it anyway, and it was just like, and I went to this place on Delancey Street, which is like where all the hip hop kids would go to buy their boom boxes. And I went into this place, and I just looked around for the largest boombox, which was a Conion, C-O-N-I-O-N, and it was on the top shelf. It was monstrous. It was the size of a building, and I said, I want to buy that, and I spent the entire Sonic Youth tour money on it. And so we met the next morning at like 6 a.m. at the studio to load the van up, and I come walking down the street with this huge thing, and I was just like, you're like, you can't be serious. I can't believe you just bought this cassette player boombox. And I said, no, it sounds great. It's going to be wonderful. But then it was a little sort of embarrassing because it didn't fit anywhere in the van. So we kind of sort of jammed it between the two seats in the front, but still it was even bigger than a seat itself. I still have it, and it has all the stickers on it from like Black Flag and Saccharine Trust and Minutemen and all these. Our whole tour was like stickered on this boombox, and I still have it. It's
still working.
Surprised, but yes, it still works.
Still working.
It's 2 cassettes, FM, AM radio, shortwave. And I was really, huh?
Is it double?
A double cassette, yeah. And then it also has inputs for microphones, so you can sort of rap along with your cassettes. Cool. But I was really kind of bummed out because a few months later I saw that they had actually sort of made one that had a push-out turntable that would come out of it, actually. I was like, man, that's like... It's
going to be huge.
It was even better, yeah. But now there's all these fetish sites on the internet for like boomboxes, and I see the one that I have, like cleaned up copies that are just astronomical, like prices. And so it kind of, I feel somewhat vindicated in buying this fine piece of work. Yeah.
But I would use the boomboxes. We had those smaller ones in my house. I had one, my sister had one, and there was one in the kitchen. And I would kind of kill them because I started doing tape cut-ups. I would scream into the microphone, and then I would and it would make this kind of amazing effect, because we cut in time. So it was fantastic. But of course, you do that for half a year, and it starts to get.
Well, there's recording qualities on cassette recorders that only exist on the cassette recorder, and that were kind of annoying when you were sort of taping records and you would sort of like hit the pause button before or after. And sometimes the pickup on the machine would be slightly slow, and so you would always have this kind of like going to speed sound. Yeah, which in retrospect I really love. It's such a great sound. But you're always trying to perfect that. We're trying not to get that. So there's just a fine little gap between songs without that kind of pickup sound on the music.
There would be big differences in different cassette decks.
Yeah.
Some would have like it was like a really good cassette deck. It would do that totally silent. You couldn't hear it.
Yeah.
That's what you paid double for that one.
Yeah.
But cheaper ones would go.
Yeah, the cassette machines as noisemakers was something I think people of our generation obviously got into, because I don't think that's certainly not what they were sort of they were built for. But as soon as you were able to sort of line a cassette player out into your amplifier and sort of fuck with the fast forward and the reverse button while pressing down the play button, and sort of were able to sort of rush the tape over the heads in different speeds, and you can regulate it sort of with your thumb. That was fantastic.
No, I still use that.
Yeah.
I mean, I do electronics. I have a big table of all kinds of stuff, oscillators, pedals, but it's pretty much always a cassette thing like this. But I also destroy these, so when I find them, I'm buying them, like tons of them, because they also wear out the rubber band that's inside them. So
we started using them on stage.
I was going to ask you that, because I remember reading that you used them between songs.
Yeah, pretty early on, around 83, 84. When we first started playing out around 1980. We were, our guitars were tuned to such these unorthodox tunings, and so we would have to spend this inordinate amount of time between songs, sort of tuning the guitars to the next piece of music, which I guess to some people in the audiences it was somewhat amusing, but for most people it was very annoying, and we'd be like, and then we would start with this song, and then do it again. So I thought like maybe it would be better to sort of play music for the audience while we were doing this. And so at first it became this thing where I would just, I would play like hits of the day, which would be like the newest Pat Benatar song or something like this. And it just sounded great, just like blasting through an amplifier because it was distorted, and the audience would just grimace because it's like, oh God, I made this like Pat Benatar. But it sounds actually really great, like distorted. So it became this whole other thing, and started refining it more, and then and doing different things and playing. I was playing, I think, like I Want to Be Your Dog, like by the Stooges between songs, or at least right before we started our own version of I Want to Be Your Dog, and so it became.
Made the original first.
Yeah.
And then you covered it.
And so when I think our third album was called Bad Moon Rising, and we wanted to sort of replicate what we were doing live with that. And so that whole record is seamless as far as the sequence goes. There's no stops between the songs, unless you flip it over. I mean, it might be between side A and side B. And that was supposed to replicate what we were doing on stage at the time. And so that record you actually hear that recording of the Stooges, which I don't know how we got away with actually releasing that. We never got permission for it, but in those days that didn't seem to be too much of a concern. And it still exists as it is with that Stooges material on there. And
you did that with Kiss also.
Yes, and we did it with Kiss on this Chicana Youth record. And that was just using a Kiss song, Strutter, and just flipping it back and forth, on the rewind. So that, I mean,
how did you get away with that? I mean,
yeah, and we got away with that as well. But I think the fact that it actually sort of takes on a different, it's almost like taking a photograph of a painting and presenting it as your own photograph, as a piece of art. So I mean, that's the only kind of way of looking at it. But that became a really big part of our thing, and I kind of missed doing that. I mean, that kind of disappeared after a while as the band sort of went forward.
You got more guitars, and people would bring out different tuning guitars too.
Yeah, I think that's probably what happened.
You just had one guitar.
I mean, I did continue to use cassettes on stage quite late into the game, but they were mostly there just for their own sake of making noise. When we get into sort of long improvisations, I would switch over to the cassette amplifier, as it were, and just go to town. But I remember when we were doing that early on, and I noticed that Dinosaur Jr. started doing it, but they were doing it so much better, or they were doing it more functionally in a way. And Lou Barlow was actually doing it, where he had it sort of the cassette continuously playing while the band was on stage, but he had an on-off switch that would mute it, and a mute switch, a foot switch. And so every time a Dinosaur Jr. would end their song, he would just hit that switch, and then this cassette tape that he had recorded, whatever he recorded on, would sort of fill the gaps between the songs. And I just thought that was like a really great way of doing it. It kind of, I think maybe in a way it sort of discouraged me from continuing to do it, because Lou had kind of sort of taken it to a new place.
You refined it, but maybe you were first and you invented it, and he kind of he refined it.
Yeah.
But also in those early days of Sonic Youth, I checked that. Their first that album, because this is just like 5 or 6 songs, and there's a tape version of that where the B-side is the whole album backwards.
Yeah, it's backwards.
Yes.
He always made. I mean, it was on SST Records. Before, it was on a label called Neutral, which is Glenn Branca's label, and we just did vinyl. And then when we signed to SST, we re-released the Neutral records, that one and Confusion S6, and they made cassettes. And they were like, well, the cassette of the first record, do you have anything else that you could put on the other side? And we were like, well, no, not from, I mean, what would we put on there? I mean, we didn't think about like what there could be, like if there's some live stuff or whatever. But we decided to play the entire record in reverse on the other side of the cassette. So yes, that's what's going on there. And plus, it sounded cool. I mean, anything played in reverse sounds just as good as it does forward.
Everything sounds better backwards. You know, it's a great trick. You think about how many people actually listen to it, right way. And
well, you obviously did. I mean, you didn't listen to Thurston at 13, but you're.
Yeah.
I remember Gibby Haynes from Butthole Surfer said he wanted to actually. I think he was attempting to record a song written in reverse, where he would actually sing the words in reverse and try to, and then play it forward and sort of see if it would sound correct for. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like it would sort of
for the Butthole Surfers, I'm sure it would.
Yes. Sort of like a faux reversal.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think he ever did it. But it sounded like such a great idea.
But you started out making albums. You went to vinyl. You didn't have like years of putting out cassettes.
No. Yeah, I mean, there was some cassette-only labels that existed coming out of the '70s. There was a tape label called Roar, O-R-O-I-R, Reach Out International Records. It was a New York label, and they put out. They were just proud of their like cassette-only thing. They did like a Bush Tetris thing and a Suicide record as a cassette, and and it's very sort of New York centric thing. And there were some cassette only labels that there was some coming out of the UK that were doing some early sort of industrial music, like what's it called, the Red Desert cassettes. And there were sort of these cassette wallets that would come out, and there was singles that would come out. You know, Malcolm McLaren did like Bow Wow Wow on cassette. He had this whole sort of mythos and romance with like the cassette is the format of punk rock, and he tried to sort of make that be a big thing, but and it was kind of, you know, it was kind of cool. I mean, Bow Wow's song was like an homage to C30, C60, C90 Go, and it was all about the immediacy of the cassette, which was sort of relative to the immediacy of the scene of punk rock, you know. And so that was it kind of made sense. It was kind of cool, and it was kind of exciting when he did that. And there were certainly cassettes that were just unique to the punk rock scene at the time, that were cassette only releases. I remember there was like a Sex Pistols interview cassette that was only available on cassette, and that was like really desirable item for those of us who were kind of collecting, like, you know, whatever was happening in the punk rock scene.
So when did you start collecting cassettes?
But collecting cassettes, I mean, at that time it wasn't about collecting cassettes because it wasn't really sort of you were just sort of, you were collecting punk rock. I mean, you're just like anything that was being released, because there was no digital medium, so it wasn't like this kind of anxiety of like, well, it just exists already, sort of in the digital sphere, you know. So there was no sort of competitive quantity to what was going on. It was just like you had vinyl, you had cassettes or whatever. And it was just sort of it was all object oriented. There was no digital. But cassette, I think that. I started collecting cassettes sort of much later on into the 80s, and it was like when I first went to Japan, and I noticed that a lot of the sort of experimental and sort of noise groups that were sort of happening in Japan that were sort of fetishizing a lot of what they were hearing from like UK industrial and European industrial music, and making these like really sort of beautifully sort of series designed cassettes on their different labels, and that was really fascinating to me. And I started buying them there and noticing that, and then it sort of led me back into sort of cassette labels that had existed primarily in the UK around like Nurse with Wound.
United, what was it called?
United Dairies. United Dairies, and you know, I never really that never really resonated with me so much, because I always thought it had a lot of sort of trappings of like sort of gothic kind of imagery, just really sort of challenging aesthetically, and using it as a, you know, as a measure of shock and just sort of you know, a measure of trying to regard horror, you know, on a very human and realistic scale. So that kind of imagery was just like really easy, very heavy kind of you know, violent sexuality, and I just didn't, you know, that didn't really appeal to me. But what was going on in the Japanese culture, which sort of took that in a way and sort of in some kind of amusement, because in a way it just regarded it as something alien to what they were into, which was like their own thing, and there was also this kind of fetish quality in their aesthetic as well. But a lot of it had to do primarily just with just the idea of noise, and it was almost like it became like what Metallica did for metal, where it's just sort of like, well, we're just going to wear dungarees and ripped shirts instead of dressing up in spandex, and so that was appealing to me. That's this kind of
like a format fetish.
We're just taking with those trappings of the brutalist imagery.
Yeah. That was a bit later also, I think.
And it was like, well, it continued, certainly. It went a bit later, and it coincided a lot with what started happening like on the cassette underground of the 90s leading into the 2000s, and it really became a very big deal. And I guess I was interested in it because it had this. Oh, let's flip this.
Hold on, sorry.
Right.
That was side A. Yeah, you were saying?
Well, it became interesting to me because it had a lot to do with the economics of making of music, and it was like it was the most economically viable format. I mean, it cost very little to produce, and it cost less to actually sort of be a consumer for than any other format. And it became these ways for new cultures to sort of trade documents of sound and noise exploration. And it was a culture that was all of a sudden, it had all this information of the first really hardcore, decade of experimental music, which was, a lot through the 80s, coming out of punk rock. I mean, it was a real appreciation and in total investigation of experimental music for young culture. And when CDs started happening in the mostly in the 90s, there was this all of a sudden these recordings that were deemed kind of lost and underground and just unfindable were being reissued on CDs, and we were being able to hear it. And so you started getting these more sort of knowledgeable factions in the music world. And so all of a sudden you would hear about somebody like John Olson doing American tapes out of Michigan, and he was releasing these cassettes of music that were informed by really arcane psychedelic sounds and ideas coming out of different parts of the world, and then people just really focusing on sort of harsh electronic noise music. And I slowly started realizing that it was this kind of new. It was a completely new scene of production, and it was completely affordable. So you could amass all these cassettes, and you started becoming part of this somewhat kind of super sub-underground society of music appreciation. And so it was kind of elite. There was something appealing about that as well. It's just like, you knew you sort of, but it was also because you had, it was super, for me it was really inspiring, it was really intriguing, it was really, I found it educational. I mean, it led me into sort of places that I thought were really radical, and I was always interested in the radical in music and this marginalized worlds of music that you felt somewhat alone in, and all of a sudden you realized there were these communities all over the world, and they were sharing the documents through cassettes.
Through the mail.
Through the mail.
Yeah, that's how I started. The wave of noise musician that you're describing now that's where I came from, late 80s, early 90s. And I thought great thing about cassettes is you don't have to make 500, because when you're starting out, there's not 500 people interested in what you do. You maybe know 20 people. So you'll go out, you buy 20 tapes, and you will dub them and send them out, and that's the addition. So it was really an affordable way of spreading your music.
Right.
I think it became elite because you just know 20 people.
There was a real personal dynamic to it. I mean, it wasn't. It was genre music in the way that genre music has a complete similarity in its production, be it reggae or country and western or whatever. It's just there's a certain similarity in the genre, which is I always liked. I like the idea of a uniform sort of practice, with a community, and there was certainly that in this music. But at the same time, there was this real sort of amazing sort of geographical personality. So you could sort of tell what was Japanese or what was, what was Norwegian or what was Swedish or what was German or what was UK. There was these ideas, and they were being shared in a way that really didn't so much exist before that. There was definitely more borders earlier because of the difficulty of communicating, because you were dependent on the postal service or whatever else. But the cassette culture of the 90s and the 2000s was concurrent with with internet culture as well. And so some of the first sort of sites that were sort of kind of chat or board sites on the internet, there were some discussion groups that were about noise music and cassette music, and you were able to sort of make available and advertise your edition of 20 cassettes that you had just done in this very small little town somewhere and really far away, and all you have to do is either trade with me or send me something, or maybe send me some money, and I will send you this cassette. And I started doing that immediately, and that was, every day was like Christmas because you would get all these cassettes. And I started going further back, and I started writing to people who had put out early sort of like Merzbow or White House cassettes on their labels, but they had disappeared from the scene, but they were kind of precursors to it, and I would find their addresses in old issues of certain magazines that dealt with kind of industrial music or whatever, and I would write to these addresses, usually never hearing something, but sometimes I would get a package in the mail. I was like, nobody's asked me about this in years. Here's the masters to the cassette I did in Thurston or something. I'd be like, wow, this is amazing. Because they had grown up, It was just like they left it behind. And little did they realize that there was this whole sort of future generation that was going to blow up out of it. And it's sort of like, in a way, it's sort of like the Stooges, It's just like, I think it was very surprising to like Iggy Pop when punk rock happened that there was actually a whole culture that was like listened to his records, because as far as he was concerned, nobody was listening. It was just like, and then all of a sudden it was just like, well, these people are listening, and it's going to change everything. So that gratification must be amazing.
It's a great thing. I did this CD box set of Cassettes, this Japanese noise band, and like collecting all their tapes, and they didn't have all the masters. Like they said, sorry, they're gone.
Right.
But we actually tracked down some of the people. Some of them are still active in the noise scene. It's very easy. But other people, it was really hard to find these people. But we did, and they still had the master tapes. And they couldn't believe that somebody wanted to have put this in like a CD box set. So you're right. There's just there's become this whole culture about reissuing this stuff, and I mean there's a German label who's dedicated to making these extremely lavish vinyl box sets, like 10 LP box sets of all cassette material, vinyl on demand.
Yes,
It's kind of insane that something that was made in 20 copies is now like this desirable, €150 object.
I had it in my mind years back to actually do compilations, like vinyl compilations on my own label, Ecstatic Piece, of what I really liked hearing on underground cassettes, whether it be like noise cassettes or sort of like weirdo folk site cassettes or whatever. I mean, and there was a lot of cross genre music going on in the cassette scene. So you would have like this kind of more Americana folk-like stuff of somebody like Wooden Wand that was sort of associative with Wolf Eyes. I mean, they were friends. They were sort of coming from the same sort of demographic, but musically they were completely, almost worlds apart, but still, I mean, appreciative of each other's ideas, and there's a lot of sort of cross-interest there. And so that's what made a lot of collecting those cassettes really interesting, because it could just go anywhere with whoever was doing whatever. And so there was a period when I was actually really listening to a lot of this stuff. And
when you listened to it?
Well, yeah, it was actually. I mean, that's another thing. I mean, it was primarily just really object oriented. I mean, I really liked it as a tactile object, and I this kind of casing with like whatever artwork would exist, I just thought was like kind of a great object, and the artwork really sort of had the capacity to sort of become more than what you can see, and you could open it up and it could fold out or whatever. And of course, what Ann Hill was talking about was the cassettes that people would sink into like concrete blocks where you sort of had to pry them out, or the famous Merzbow cassette that was an edition of one that was inside of the car cassette, and you had to buy the car to hear it.
It was sealed up. Yeah.
So there was things like that. There was like it had no fear of being absurd, and it was just like But for the most part, cassettes were all sort of handcrafted and handmade, and they would be numbered, and there was something very sort of personalized about them. At the same time, you knew that the artist actually sort of touched the same thing you were touching.
They were kind of art objects in a way.
Yeah, and they were art objects, and so I had this idea that I would make these vinyl compilations of these different great things I would hear on these cassettes, and I started trying to compile them, but I did not do this. And I kind of regret it to this day, because I think it's still something that can be done, but it would require not doing anything else.
Okay.
Such as, like, I wouldn't be here right now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you couldn't come to Oslo. So maybe you shouldn't do it. But back to the thing about cassettes being art objects, and also, as you said, that every day was like Christmas. Because back in the 90s, I would get stuff in the mail almost pretty much every day.
Yeah. And
it would be a lot of great stuff, a lot of weird stuff, and I remember one had a teddy bear in the mail. There's a teddy bear, and somebody had cut it open, put a tape inside, and then it had like safety pins, like 5 safety pins. So you had to open the safety pins to take out the tape. And I always felt that maybe some kid is missing his teddy bear.
There was an exhibit in New York City at Printed Matter, which is a artist bookstore of note, and there was an exhibit of underground cassette art for the most part, and it was curated where different cassette and noise artists would display what they thought was really amazing in their collections or whatever. And so it was people like I think like Dennis Tiefus from Antwerp, and I think John Olson from Michigan, and then myself. And I was, and most of the tapes on display were kind of, like you said, there were these kind of more outlandish kind of tapes. But I was really sort of more, there's a lot of tapes that were just like really, they're really beautiful. And they're really, sometimes they would just be really elegant, just simple cassettes with the artist's work on it. And it made me realize at the time that a lot of the music makers who were just devoted and vocational to just being part of the cassette underground and not having too much ambition beyond that to like make an LP or make a CD or actually go on the road and open for some like big time band. That was not part of their consciousness. There was a certain glory in not having that ambition and sort of being very happy just doing that cassette and doing performances in basements around the world and being part of that culture. And it was a really wonderful kind of society to be in. And it certainly had nothing to do with any kind of like revenue. I mean, you were lucky to get enough sort of petrol money to get from one place to the next, and that was what it was all about. And I realized that a lot of it was people who had a concurrent interest not in just sort of making music and sound and noise, but also visual art. And that was really interesting to me because that's something that really always attracted me to moving to New York City and getting involved with sort of the punk rock and avant-garde scene. There was always a very defined sort of communication relationship between being a visual artist and being an audio artist. And that was really prevalent in the cassette underground. Certainly somebody who I keep mentioning, like John Olson from Wolf Eyes,
who's now made 1,000 releases of his American tapes.
Has he reached 1,000
Yeah,
releases?
I think he did, like New Year's was like the big...
He had a party.
He had a party. I think that's the end of the label also, because he made 1,000 and...
Well, that's another thing. I mean, the cassette underground, as we're speaking of it, that existed for so long, is pretty much in a way has sort of moved on, moved forward, has sort of, and a lot of it has to do with it being really sort of part of this kind of human condition where people grow up. John Olson is married, has a child. He's got employment. He studied to be a professional electrician, and that's what he's doing with his world. And he still does his interest in music and art is still there, but it's also I think as a lot of people in that community in the '90s into the 2000s, they've gone on. And you can be an underground cassette noise artist for so long, and you kind of have to sort of maybe do more than that. I mean, it's okay. I'm not making any judgments on you. Or what do you? You'll be a cassette noise artist until the day you die.
Never quitting. Yeah, but it's true. I mean, when I was.
But I mean, John Olsen actually did this interview recently on tour with Wolf Eyes, and that people were just sort of like sending to each other on the internet. Like he was coming out and said, like, the noise music scene is dead. It's like, and now we're interested in composition, and like, it's really sort of focusing on what composition can be, as opposed to sort of like these ideas of improvisation and sort of the idea of just this liberated idea of sound and music. And now we're sort of looking at these concepts of.
That's what 1,000 releases will do to you.
But in his own sort of unique way. I mean, not like, not denying that, composition has been sort of investigated quite a bit. But so that was kind of, but for him, who's sort of a figurehead to so many people in that scene, to sort of say like, it's toast. Put a fork in it. Let's move forward. That was kind of like, that was kind of an amazing thing to say. It was almost like saying hippie is dead, or or something.
But I think with John and me, when we started out making noise as teenagers, and we do it, in our 20s, and so these labels are kind of like journals. The label you do is kind of like a journal of your life, of figuring out stuff and trying out things. And you do it when you're 20 and maybe 30, but I guess.
And you do it in editions of 20 and 30.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what's really kind of wild about it.
But if I look at my discography, in the 90s it was like 20, 40 tapes a year, and now I do one or two, just kind of to keep it in shape. But it's not as urgent anymore as it was.
I mean, to me, it's interesting that there has yet to be a real encyclopedic retrospective of what the tape underground is and was. And I think, in a way, I mentioned that interview with John because I just think like, okay, we need parameters here, and that's probably a good cutoff point, as John Olsen saying, tape once it's dead. And and you can sort of start with kind of like the earliest sort of forays in the late '70s coming out of industrial music and sort of move forward. But that kind of history and an actual checklist, an actual sort of discography of it would be immense. It would be incredibly immense because it was completely global.
It would be impossible.
It's near impossible. And I even early on in the '90s, I remember being in Japan and talking to some like noise collectors there, and I was saying like, is there anybody that that probably would have all these early industrial noise cassettes that were sort of being produced? And they said, well, Masami Akita would have them because he was first on the scene with that stuff, and everything was sent to him, and he was just like sending everything to everybody. So he has everything. And so I thought that, well, that's good to know. And I always wonder if Masami Akita is Merzbow, this is nom de plume. But so there are people between yourself, between myself and other people. I think there's somebody like Henry Rollins from Black Flag, and Henry Rollins never really recorded that I know of, like any kind of underground noise cassettes. He was just the singer of Black Flag, and he's Henry Rollins, who's his own person as far as being a writer or a performer, orator. He's put it upon himself the last few years to be the custodial guy for the American Tapes label, which was really you laugh because it's amusing. It's just like, well, okay, but he's been seriously involved for years of trying to sort of locate every item on American Tapes, and he's done it by going to the source, by going to John Olsen, and he's gone to people like myself or Byron Coley and sort of said, I'm willing to sort of purchase anything that you might have doubles on, or you just like, are you done with it by now? You must be done with it by now. But I figured that I just thought that was like really kind of I thought that was wonderful that somebody like Henry Rollins decided to become the custodian to like this noise cassette label of note, and wanting to sort of put in his library all 1,000 copies, even though some of these things only exist in the ether. Like the 1,000th copy, the 1,000th release was an event.
Yeah, New Year's party.
Which is, labels have done this in the past. I mean, obviously, they give release numbers to events or to other kinds of ephemera or whatever. But so, I mean, things like that's kind of amazing to me.
Yeah, but
what was the name of your cassette label?
I had one called TWR tapes. One of them. Okay. But I started out, I didn't have a label name, so there was years of just like making stuff. And I didn't keep copies myself.
Yeah.
And the master tapes are just like, maybe it says September 1991, I don't know if I actually made a release of that or not, And a few of them, maybe I made 5 copies, and some I made 50 at the most. Mm. And it would be variable length, because I would go to the convenience store and they would sell these tapes for cheap that was pre-recorded, and the length would vary. Right. So if my master was 60 minutes, but I got a bunch of tapes that was just 40 minutes, missing. But that didn't matter. That thing. It was, it's not the whole thing, but it's enough. You just send it back.
And these are tape labels that have actual imprints. They're imprints. They're label names, or they're sort of defined by the label, by the imprint of the label. But then there's the whole sort of network and culture of just sort of personalized cassettes that people make, as Anne was talking earlier in this book that Eva and I had done of mixtape. It was like they were love letters, and there was tapes that you would make with somebody you love, and that was really important. and then there's these really. I tell people about these cassettes that I have from the artist Dan Graham that he recorded on his little Nakamichi deck in the 70s of all the no-wave bands. When I was working on doing this book on no-wave with Byron Coley, it was an amazing source material for us. And he actually was one of the few people who was going to see these bands with a good cassette recorder, and he recorded really early Contortions and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks and Mars shows.
On Nakamichi.
Unlike this Nakamichi deck.
Yeah, maybe people don't know that Nakamichi is that's the greatest tape deck and tape recorder you could get. And anybody would tell you that tapes always sounds crap, you should put them in front of a Nakamichi and just have a good tape, and
but just don't
amazing.
Just don't let Dan Graham be the one operating the machine.
so tapes can actually sound really good.
Yeah. But there's about a half dozen of these cassette tapes that Dan Graham had in his place, and I used to live just below him in the early '80s, and of course at that time I just it was, I didn't think that much of it because it was still near enough to the time period when this stuff happened. But as time went on, and we became more sort of kind of romantically involved with like what happened in that history, and we wanted to do this book on no wave. I remembered Dan Graham Henry's tapes, and I went to him and made copies of them, and so there's these wonderful the live recordings that people had made on cassette that you hear about. And again, not to bring Henry Rollins back into the mix, but I remember Henry Rollins was like one of the great cassette collectors in the early '80s, and he was renowned for writing letters to everybody around the world to amass like the largest live birthday party cassette collection in the world. And he had every single gig they had ever done that had been recorded on cassette in his library. And it wasn't just the birthday party, it was like his own group, Black Flag, and it was things that he was just kind of interested in. He wanted every live recording that was available, no matter what the quality, and he would notate it on on the spines of the cassette, and I believe he probably still has this collection, but it must be amazing. But those are completely personal collections of cassettes. And it's always wonderful to me to go into like charity shops and thrift stores and what have you, and then you'll find cassettes from that era of people's tiny little handwriting of like what records are on there, and then you can buy them for nothing, obviously, and most of them are pretty. You don't want them. They're like Depeche Mode and stuff like this, but sometimes it's just sort of like it'll just say Mix or Queen or whatever, but they sound great. And that's another aspect or a factor of what we're talking about that we haven't really addressed is like what cassettes sound like. I mean, this tape is like fat ferrous oxide that sort of goes over these roller heads, and you play it at different biases. There's like normal bias, and there's CRO2 bias, and then there's chrome bias. And there's also sort of Dolby noise reduction that you can sort of like flip on or off, usually on these machines. And Dolby was a way of sort of declicking and getting rid of sort of unwanted sounds on tape. And eventually Dolby was a big business that was sort of like clean tape up, so when it would be mastered to vinyl, you wouldn't hear like any of these sort of nefarious kind of sounds that had nothing to do with the recorded music. But usually you could sort of have the option of taking the Dolby off on these machines, and you would hear this tape hiss or whatever, which we would just, that's what we wanted to hear, right? That's what we wanted to hear. So, that was like really great, and you could actually sort of keep taping something over and over again. So it was like a Xerox over, so it would become more and more noisy, and so the tape hiss would become more prevalent, and it would override the actual sort of like source music, and that was always kind of a wonderful thing to do. But the actual sound for myself, cassette tapes was kind of, to this day, I feel like the best sound for audio. I mean, I find it to be completely kind of engaging because it's total analog, and it's not music you're hearing in any sort of numerical way, the way digital is. So the brain doesn't decipher it immediately the way it deciphers numerical information on digital. The brain hears it. And when it hears it again, it doesn't really necessitate having to hear it again because it's already processed it. But listening to cassette tapes and to some extent vinyl, it's always kind of, it's always somewhat new, the listening experience, the processing experience. And I think tape is even richer than vinyl, trying to sort of replicate tape as a format anyway. But vinyl was always interesting because it was being mastered, and so the art of mastering for vinyl was kind of a wonderful. It was a wonderful audio art that sort of got lost in the world of digital, especially this whole thing of remastering for like CDs. It's just not the same because it's not the same mastering machinery. It's just digital machinery, so it's by nature it's something else entirely.
I agree that the sound of tape is fantastic, and I think a lot of us noise artists that's the reason we're noise artists, because of tape. And if I had only digital recording device, I don't think I would have even done this stuff. And in my first years, I didn't have any pedals. I had no pedals. It was all tape distortion. Just putting a very hot signal into the tape and just overriding it to the max. And it would just have a beautiful sound.
Yeah.
It was just when you reach the limit to digital, it sounds terrible. But when you reach the limit to tape, it starts just becoming just colors, and you could explore that, and there's so much there.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I started making noise, is because of these tapes and how they sounded when you would push them beyond what they were supposed to be pushed.
Did you ever use reel-to-reels as opposed to cassette tapes?
Now I do, but not as a kid, because I didn't have that then. I bought those later. but I just started with cassette tapes.
Yeah.
I know I had one of those double decks, you know, that you could copy one cassette to another.
Duping decks.
Duping decks, but I found out that Dad had a really cheap stereo, because I could dupe at double speed, but it would still take, you know, the input from the turntable. So if I would do stuff on the turntable, you know, that would be half speed when you play that back, you know. So that's how I overdubbed in the beginning, and back and forth, and then you get this half speed, really fantastic.
Yeah.
So it was really something to explore, and I did for years before I bought any pedals or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Just tape distortion, and every tape deck would sound differently when you pushed it. So you know, it'd be so many variables and stuff you can do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I asked about the reel-to-reels because when Sonic Youth first started, Lee Ronaldo was doing stuff with reel-to-reels at the time, like doing sort of taped experimental stuff that way. And on the first sort of proper Sonic Youth record, which was Confusion is Sex, after that mini LP that was backwards, there's a piece of music on there called Lee is Free, which is sort of this tape music that he had brought in from doing these reel-to-reel experiments at the time. And I very rarely see people utilize reel-to-reels now in any experimental way, and I just think they're just, as sound emitters, they're just so great sounding.
Oh, they sound fantastic.
Yeah.
But I didn't have access to it then. The reason I started was the stuff was there. You know, I had the tape recorder in my room, so once you start going, well, there's stuff happening, you start to push this stuff. And you know, I didn't know about William Burroughs and cut-up stuff then. You know, I heard about that later. So when I read Naked Lunch and learned about the cut-up technique, it was more kind of a confirmation and
it's over.
It's over. Sorry. That's it.
Tape's over. Thank you, everybody.